There is a stigma around STIs. Even with perfect hygiene, people are still getting UTIs. Especially Black women have been subjected. They've been used, they've been studied, they've been cut open and experimented on without consent. Period pain is normal, but period pain that interferes with your daily life is not. What if the reason you haven't gotten answers isn't because your body is broken, but because the system was never built to listen to you? Welcome to G-Chats. Hi guys, welcome back to G-Chats with your host, Gianna Jara. We are here in the G-Spot, ready for the next episode. Today's episode is about mycoplasma. So last week's episode was all about ureaplasma, and I felt like it made more sense to kind of give each of these bacterium their own episode, just because last season I did combine them, and I think a lot of you were interested in talking about ureaplasma. It went semi-viral, like a lot of people love that episode. It's my highest viewed episode. I wanted to give ureaplasma kind of its moment to have everyone understand it better and have the science exist and be there. I also wanted to give attention to mycoplasma because it shouldn't be ignored either. It is important to understand, and I feel like it kind of slips through the cracks. Not enough people know enough about it. And I think too, when we talk about vaginal health, one of the biggest areas of confusion happens to be mycoplasma, and it gets thrown around a lot, and many women hear about it on a lab report, let's say, or sometimes they will just hear about it on social media and immediately panic, not knowing whether it's something normal, something dangerous, or something that needs to be treated right away. So today I wanted to break it down in a way that actually makes sense, and it's because not all mycoplasma is created equal, and I think that that's important to highlight. So at a high level, mycoplasma are a group of very small bacteria that can live in the urogenital tract. And what makes them unique, exactly like ureaplasma, is that they don't have a cell wall, which means a lot of common antibiotics like penicillins, they do not work against mycoplasma the same way that they do not work against ureaplasma. They're also harder to detect because they don't have a cell wall. It's more difficult to detect than typical bacteria. So because it's difficult to detect and difficult to treat, it is why they've become a part of such a confusing topic in female reproductive health. Things start to matter when we dive deeper into the area of mycoplasma because there are different types of mycoplasma and they behave very differently in the body. This is with all bacteria. There's lactobacilli, there's bifidobacterium, there's so many different bacterial groups and families, and then there's different strains. And when we're talking about mycoplasma in regards to vaginal health, there are two main mycoplasma strains. There's Mycoplasma hominis and Mycoplasma genitalium. And that's really important because understanding the difference between these two is everything so that you don't panic and you can understand your body better. So Mycoplasma hominis can actually exist as a part of the vaginal microbiome for some people. This is what we see with even ureaplasma. We talked, and I'm sorry that I'm drawing a lot of similarities back to ureaplasma, but there really are a lot of similarities between ureaplasma and mycoplasma, which is why I'm like kind of making the connection, because if you are even remotely familiar with ureaplasma, this will help you understand mycoplasma a bit better. There are women who have Mycoplasma hominis in their vaginal microbiome, and that is normal. It can exist as a normal part of the vaginal microbiome, and that means that it can be present without necessarily causing any harm. That is what we would call conditionally commensal. So it's not a protected bacteria like lactobacillus, but it's also not a direct pathogen. So where it tends to show up the most is in the presence of bacterial vaginosis, also known as BV. Now, why that's the case is because BV is not caused by a single bacteria that has overgrown, a single organism that has overgrown. Instead, it's a shift in the entire microbial community, and we talk about this often. In this shift, you see a decrease of lactobacillus species and an increase of usually anaerobic bacteria like Gardnerella, Prevotella, and Mycoplasma hominis often rises alongside them, even though it's not an anaerobic bacteria. And why this is the case is because I talk about this all the time. Lactobacillus bacteria keeps the vaginal microbiome in check. When these guys decrease, commensal bacteria, so bacteria that normally lives in the vagina and doesn't do anything, can thrive, overgrow, and cause problems. And that is why it is called conditionally commensal, because there are conditions. It's commensal, but conditions apply. So essentially, there's a time and a place when these type of bacteria can cause problems. And when given the right condition, they will cause problems. When BV happens, when the entire ecosystem collapse, Mycoplasma hominis can actually start causing problems and it can start to rise. And that's where you might see symptoms. The key here is that when Mycoplasma hominis is detected, it's usually not the root cause of the issue. It's more of a reflection of the environment because, again, it usually doesn't thrive unless the environment is unstable. So it's there because the microbiome is imbalanced, not necessarily because it independently caused the imbalance itself. And this is why clinically we don't typically treat Mycoplasma hominis on its own. Instead, we would treat the broader dysbiosis, which in this case, for the example I used, would be bacterial vaginosis. And as the environment improves and you restore lactobacillus in the vagina through probiotic supplementation, it then moves away from this idea. M. hominis often then decreases naturally because the lactobacillus has been restored. So this is really important so that you could shift the thinking, because it really moves us away from the idea that everything we detect in the vagina needs to be aggressively eliminated. And instead, it shifts you towards the idea of rebuilding a healthy ecosystem. And this is what I like to explain or kind of draw the similarity to. We talked a lot back in like 2020 about skincare and how skincare was booming on TikTok. The skincare industry saw a massive boom during 2020, during the pandemic. People were home, new companies were coming out, like The Ordinary really popped off in 2020, and people were doing aggressive peels. I always think back to The Ordinary's AHA, like red peel that people were doing. And it was like this strong, intense peel that people were doing at home. And people were experimenting with skincare in a way that we've never seen before. And one of the core things that we now see today in 2026 is everything is about the skin barrier. Everything's about restoring the skin barrier, healing your skin barrier, being careful with your skin barrier. And the reason why this shift has happened is because a lot of people were aggressive with those peels, with those AHAs, BHAs, retinoids, and they were just using so much at once, didn't have enough knowledge about their skin. And what happens is when you're focused on attack, eliminate, you compromise the integrity of your skin, which makes you more vulnerable to these infections. So similarly, you can't focus on eliminating every single bacteria that exists in the vagina, because your vagina is never going to be sterile and not have any bacteria. The idea is target what the root cause is. So in many cases, when M. hominis starts to rise, it is because of an already existing dysbiosis. Normally, bacterial vaginosis is the cause. So you treat the overgrowth of these anaerobes. And in turn, when you start to restore lactobacillus, this is where you can see a shift in the vaginal microbiome's health, because now M. hominis can naturally decrease. And for some people, they might want antibiotics to treat M. hominis. But the idea here is that there's more of a focus on the microbiome being completely collapsed versus let's attack M. hominis, if that makes sense. So that's the key when it comes to Mycoplasma hominis, is addressing that broader vaginal dysbiosis that we're seeing, and not just like attacking the mycoplasma, because that's usually not the thing that's growing on its own. And some people might push back and say it's been present even in my healthy vaginal microbiome and I feel uncomfortable. In that case, you can maybe pursue and talk to your physician about antibiotics. But for the most part, addressing that imbalance and restoring balance into the vaginal microbiome would help rebuild this healthy ecosystem that moves us away towards aggressive attack and rebuild mindset. On the other hand, we have Mycoplasma genitalium. And Mycoplasma genitalium is completely different. This is not considered a normal part of the vaginal microbiome. It is actually classified as a sexually transmitted infection, and it is not something that just appears because your vaginal microbiome is imbalanced. It is introduced through sexual contact, and unlike Mycoplasma hominis, when Mycoplasma genitalium is detected, it absolutely requires treatment. It's not something that you say, oh, like I'll try to rebuild my ecosystem or treat BV first. You have to treat the Mycoplasma genitalium because it is a sexually transmitted infection, and leaving STIs untreated can spread to the upper reproductive tract and cause pelvic inflammatory disease and infertility. So it's super important that you do treat it. Now, one of the biggest issues with Mycoplasma genitalium is that it is not included in standard STI panels. So most routine screenings test for things like chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV, syphilis. Mycoplasma genitalium requires a very specific PCR test or NAT test, and that is usually only ordered when symptoms are persistent or unexplained, or the patient themselves asks their physician about it. Most physicians won't even order a Mycoplasma genitalium STI test. If you're one of the few who has had a physician who did order it proactively, then you have a very good physician. But many gynecologists and OBGYNs, they're not familiar with Mycoplasma genitalium. They just do the standard STI panel that includes the gonorrhea, chlamydia, HIV, syphilis, and sometimes hepatitis, but they will not review or even think to look at Mycoplasma genitalium. A lot of times the patients have to advocate for themselves and ask for the Mycoplasma PCR test themselves. If it's detected, it needs to be treated. So a lot of women are told that everything comes back normal because their standard STI panel will come back normal, but they're still experiencing symptoms. And this could be one of the missing pieces, mycoplasma. Symptoms of Mycoplasma genitalium can overlap heavily with other conditions, things like vaginal irritation, unusual discharge, burning with urination, pelvic discomfort. So it is often mistaken for BV, a UTI, yeast infection, or a different STI, which is why they run the standard STI panel. And if that comes back negative, it's kind of like, oh, everything's fine, like you're negative. So on top of that, it does have a high rate of antibiotic resistance, which makes it even more difficult to treat and can contribute to ongoing or recurrent symptoms if it is not properly identified. Now, in terms of transmission, Mycoplasma genitalium is primarily spread through vaginal or anal sex. There are often questions. A lot of people have DM'd me and asked me if it can be transmitted orally. I will say, like, theoretically, from a scientific perspective, as a biomedical engineer, it is theoretically possible, but it's not considered a major route of spread. And it's because this bacteria prefers the urogenital tract and it does not commonly colonize the throat. That's like a difference between Mycoplasma genitalium versus something like gonorrhea. Gonorrhea can be in the throat. Mycoplasma genitalium is not usually existing in the throat. So when we think about risk and transmission, we're usually only focusing on the urogenital tract. The reason why this is super important to discuss ultimately is we have to bring it back to the bigger picture of vaginal health, because mycoplasma really highlights something that I talk about a lot: the difference between an infection and an imbalance. And not everything that shows up on a test is the root cause, and not everything needs to be treated in isolation. So in the case of bacterial vaginosis, we are dealing with a disruption of the entire microbial ecosystem. In the case of Mycoplasma genitalium, we're dealing with a specific pathogen that was introduced and needs to be targeted. And Mycoplasma hominis is just a part of the root cause issue. And the root cause is usually a dysbiosis that exists pre-Mycoplasma hominis overgrowing. So this is where it's really important to understand the role of probiotics and microbiome support, because probiotics are not a treatment of Mycoplasma genitalium. They will never be a treatment of any pathogenic, conditionally commensal bacterium. And they are not a replacement for antibiotics when an infection is present, but they play a critical role in rebuilding the microbiome after treatment, restoring lactobacillus dominance, and then helping to create an environment that is less susceptible to recurrent infections or chronic imbalances. So if there's one takeaway from this episode in understanding mycoplasma, it is that context matters. The presence of bacteria alone will not tell the full story. No matter how hard the internet will try to convince you it does, it doesn't. We have to understand what kind of bacteria we're dealing with, how it behaves in the body, whether it's a part of an imbalance or an infection, and what the appropriate response actually is. Because the goal isn't to always just eliminate bacteria. It is to restore balance, function, and long-term health. Probiotics help with that, but identifying the pathogen is super important. Identifying the conditionally commensal bacterium is super important, and making sure that you advocate for yourself is super important. So these kind of videos are so near and dear to my heart and so important, because I find that once people learn about this, they know how to go into their doctor's office and advocate for themselves. And that's key. That's something that we don't see. A lot of times people will go undiagnosed for years because they don't even know that mycoplasma exists. They don't know that ureaplasma exists. So a video like this is so helpful because you can understand mycoplasma. You can understand I'm someone who has BV, but even when I'm testing negative for BV, I'm still feeling off. Now you can say, is Mycoplasma genitalium here? If you are sexually active and you have multiple partners, you can now consider the possibility of, is Mycoplasma genitalium something that exists and something that maybe is causing these hidden symptoms, these symptoms I'm having, and I'm taking my BV medication, but it's not going away. Or if you're someone who is not sexually active, you can rule Mycoplasma genitalium out, but you could say, is Mycoplasma hominis in my vagina? Is it overgrowing? Did I not restore my vaginal microbiome? And is that thriving alongside anaerobic bacteria and contributing to my symptoms? That is possible. So understanding this information is super important because it allows you to advocate for yourself better, ask the right questions, get the right tests done, get the right treatment, and be able to restore the microbiome after your treatment. I hope that this video about mycoplasma was incredibly helpful. Let me know what you guys think down below. Have you ever experienced mycoplasma? Have you spoken to your doctor about mycoplasma? Let me know what your experience was down below, and let me know what other videos you'd like to see from me in season 2 of G Chats. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in the next video. Bye guys.